All right, so the main focus for us this week, although I know you're probably thinking, Mr. Williams, I didn't even see that much. You kept talking about equators and longitude and latitude and hemispheres and all these words. Our main goal this week is to absolutely talk about the equator and the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere and how there's opposite seasons and those types of things because of the tilt of the earth. And I want you to know the word longitude because it's very similar to latitude, and they'll throw that in a question every now and then. But our main goal is to get to this by the end of the week. These weird-looking symbols that we see on here and understand what they mean and be able to kind of predict the weather based on knowing what kind of front is moving in. Now, the front questions show up a lot when we're talking about weather. And so I want to make sure that we've covered those things as we go through this week. And that's kind of what we're starting off with. All right, I got a little worried there for a moment. So we're going to talk today and start off with latitude and longitude, 2 words on our vocabulary sheet, right? We saw those today. Longitude are lines that run vertically. Those are the ones that go up and down. Again, for our vocabulary, it said it's also called the meridians. And the reason why is you have this thing that is almost like the equator, except it goes up and down. It's called the prime meridian. And so if you base it off of this, how far you go to the east and to the west of that line, that prime meridian, which is going to be like the 0, kind of gives you an idea where you would be on the globe. And I think that that's important. I'm not as concerned about longitude as I am these lines of latitude that are divided by the equator, and they run horizontally. And so how far you are away from the equator plays far more importance when we start looking at weather than how far away you are from the prime meridian, because the prime meridian just kind of gives you location, where how far you are from the equator is going to give us an idea of how hot or cold the climate is in the area that you live. 0 degrees latitude is the equator. 0 degrees latitude is the equator. Now for us, I think in the vocabulary words, the definition of the equator is that imaginary line that divides the earth into the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And those words are going to become very important to us because, Sterling, they're going to ask you at some point, they're going to say, Susan lives in the southern hemisphere and it is winter. She's calling her friend who lives in the northern hemisphere just to chat. What season is she most likely experiencing? Well, if you're switching to a different hemisphere, it's going to be the opposite season. So if it was winter for her, it's going to be summer for the other person. And those questions can get very tricky. I will try to make sure we've had plenty of those questions before we even get to the test so that we understand what they're asking and how they're asking and the misconceptions that they kind of want you to make on that, because we don't want to do that. And again, I've seen some questions that talk about your east or west of the prime meridian. That tells me absolutely nothing. Where I am on this side of the globe, east or west, tells me nothing about my weather. It is where you are located as far as north or south of the equator is going to tell me my climate. Based on what time of the year it is, I'm going to be able to determine what season it is. And I think once we've done that a few times, we'll get kind of used to that. So that's something that we'll get to see later on. For us, we're going to come back and watch this video, obviously, after this. I don't want any copyright issues going on, so we're going to keep moving on. All right, northern and southern hemispheres. So we have this equator. I think that might be a very important thing for us to go ahead and start jotting down in our notes, because that is what's going to divide the earth into the northern and southern hemispheres, which would kind of bring us into our first of the vocabulary words for today. So when we look at this equator, this imaginary line that divides the earth into northern and southern hemispheres, we now have to start looking at the northern and the southern hemispheres. No shock here if you know your compass at all, right? The northern hemisphere is the top half. It is above the equator, while the southern hemisphere is below the equator. Again, I say this in jest because I'm sure somebody's going to get it mixed up, but I don't know that could be any easier, right? If you know your north, south, east, and west, you're doing good there. Here's the part that's very difficult sometimes for folks. They have opposite seasons. And the reason why they have opposite seasons, Jackson, is because of the tilt of the earth. And as you go around the sun, I'll get the globe out in a minute and kind of show you this, but as you're going around the sun, there are certain parts of the year where you are facing a little closer to the sun and you get more direct sunlight. That would be your summertime, which we are heading into now, right? We got to get to spring, but like we're getting to that point. We have a little bit of winter left. It's supposed to be kind of really cold, like next week, like 19 to get back in those super cold temperatures. But we're moving towards that. But if it's winter here, I feel like they're coming to the end of their summer in the southern hemisphere, right? So they're heading into the fall as we're heading into spring. But again, that part is very important. I don't need you to memorize all these. And if they start asking really crazy questions and they get too detailed as far as geography goes, unless it's an EOG or a benchmark, I feel comfortable answering that question for you. If they just name some random place like Susie lives in New Zealand and it's summer, like, yeah, right. What is that, northern or southern? Anybody know? Exactly. We would have to talk about that because that might be a question that were like a 2 hands went up, but 32 hands stayed down. So I would have to answer that for you. But again, that's something we'll get to as we move later on. The northern hemisphere is the top half of the earth. It's above the equator. The southern hemisphere is the bottom half that is going to be below the equator. I'm going to put that in the notes. I don't feel like that's that hard, but I'm going to put it in there anyway because I don't want somebody getting confused about these two things because it can be a little difficult. The northern hemisphere is above the equator. The southern hemisphere is below the equator. I'll pause this so people can. All right. So again, you're going to see in your notes, you're going to see latitude, which is the lines that tell you how far you are away from the equator. And the further away you get from the equator, the cooler your temperatures are going to get because you are not getting as direct sunlight. The closer you live to the equator, the warmer it's going to be. That's why, sorry to touch a sore spot here, when Miss Beasley went to Disney, without other people, it was 80-something degrees, like 86 degrees. And she said it was hot, and like add in all the people waiting in lines, it was kind of miserable because 86 in Florida, I bet you the humidity was high because it's surrounded by water. That is a hot and muggy day when it's 86. So, because I'm just picking on her, and like, yes, adults like to go away sometimes. The further south you get, the warmer it gets. The further north you go, the colder it gets. That's why if we were up in Canada right now, or even further, it would be very cold, where later on it might not be as cold. Question. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about it now, just in case I missed it in the slides. Because with us having to redo all of the notes, I had to redo all the slides last night. Because a lot of the slides talked about jet streams, and it talked about El Niños and La Niñas, all stuff that we don't study anymore in science, in 5th grade at least. So I had to delete stuff and put new stuff in. So I do want to pull this up and kind of put this in here. The closer you are to the equator, the warmer your climate. The farther away you go, north or south, because you've got the North Pole and the South Pole. The cooler your weather or slash climate gets. Warmer, it should be a W. I mean an M. Oh my goodness. Monday. All right. The closer you are to the equator, the warmer your climate. The farther away you go, north or south of the equator, the cooler the weather, the climate gets. That's obvious to us. You have your rainforest at the equator where it stays warm all the time. You're not expecting to see any rainforest and tropical forest if you're at the North or South Pole, because we know that that's tundra area, which we learned in ecosystems, and it's cool there all the time. We're going to. So for us in the class, we are going to go ahead and answer these. So go ahead and answer these whopping 3 questions. For the people at home, we are wrapping up today. We've talked about latitude, longitude, equator, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, how the seasons are different and opposite, how you're warmer when you're closer to the equator, you're cooler the further away you get north or south. And that is going to be our introduction to this week's stuff about weather fronts and global air masses, which we will get into, as you can see on the next page we saw later on. Like, subscribe, notification bell, all that other wonderful stuff.